couldn't go any further out away from Second Samuel without going back and talking about the Forest of Ephraim because it's just so good. I think I mentioned it on the day. This would be Second Samuel 18 is where we see this story. It's a story that I never heard when I was in church, Sunday school, any kind of summertime Bible camp. I never heard this story. And I feel like it's a big injustice. So I'm going to go through the story and then I'm going to break down what's going on here. So this is when King David is getting old and his son Absalom has stepped up and claimed his birthright, his right of ascension because he was the oldest to take over the throne. And he didn't wait until dad anoints him. He's gone out and now not only has he tried to take the throne, but he's fighting against David. And so David has to go out. He has to take troops to go after Absalom. And we read about this battle in 2 Samuel 18, where David has sent out his troops under the command of Job. And the people wanted David to stay at home. He's getting old. He's getting feeble. So he's not there. And he instructs when everybody goes out, he's like, please be gentle, be nice to my son. Well, your son is threatening you and all of the kingdom, so that's obviously going to be a problem. He's not a good guy. The battle, we're told, takes place in the Forest of Ephraim. And the numbers here are that the people that were with the people of Israel that had gathered around Absalom, that were with him fighting against David's forces, 20,000 men, armed men of that force were killed in the battle out on the plain. But it says here that the forest devoured more than the sword. So we're told that 20,000 men died, were killed by David's troops, but more of them were killed by the forest than David's troops. And then to further emphasize, I think we need to take a moment and see that the forest has action here. So we can read just that far, and I think that this is probably why we never hear of it in church is this is a fantastical story. It's Lord of the Rings level stuff where the forest comes to life and is part of the battle. We see the Ents that actually are beings they look like trees, but they're really another life form. But even beyond looking at these sort of creatures, we see the forest in Lord of the Rings coming to life itself and having agency in the battle. Really, obviously that brings to mind, as I'm reading this, it brings that kind of cinematic situation to the forefront for me. But I think as church readers, we are, or the church leadership, we see this getting kind of glossed over. Like, okay, well, maybe they fell down holes or they tripped over limbs, or it was just, I've seen this analyzed online where the trees were just really close together. And so people were getting hurt as they were racing through. But the story goes on to say that Absalom he's riding a mule and his head gets stuck in an oak branch fork. So there's an oak branch that's going out over presumably a path and it forks. And somehow Absalom, while riding through the forest, gets his head stuck in this fork. And so he is left to hang there. And eventually he's killed. Well, this sort of emphasizes a different reading, I think, of the passage. You'd have to work really hard to get your head stuck in the fork of a branch in such a way that as you are not capable of getting free, you cannot get away. You can't take a knife, and if it's your hair or your beard tangled, you can't cut that free and get down. It's a fantastical thing. It's a leap here to think that he has no way of getting free from his head being stuck in an oak branch. To the extent that if your head gets wedged in some way, that you aren't able to get free. Like, he doesn't free himself even when somebody comes to stab him with spears. I think we have to read this as the forest has agency. And that is, I think, really troubling to a lot of church dogma, church leadership. We have been taught, even within the church for centuries, to other the forest, to other, especially the forest, the devil's in the forest, the devil's in the dark places, to other creation. We want to go inside of a building. We need to have stained glass and pews and order. It has to be, everything has to be followed and clean and safe. Only when we're away from that troubling outdoors are we going to be able to be pure and holy and sacred. And meanwhile, God created the outside. So this idea that we're supposed to be afraid of nature, afraid of creation, that God isn't out there, is something that has been perpetuated for a really long time. You're not supposed to go out into the forest because you won't have discernment to know whether you're hearing evil, whether you're being directed by evil because it is out there, or whether you're hearing God. And so I think it's troubling to talk about God's creation having agency for him, going to war for him. But it's such a disservice. I think that when we skip over fantastical sections of the Bible like this, when we make it mundane, we train new believers and young kids, we train them to see the Bible as a fairy tale, that there are fantastical leaps of imagination that are being written. Why would God inspire man to write fantastical leaps of imagination that are more unicorns and dragons? And why would God have man write that down? If we believe that everything is God breathed in the Bible, why would we have these moments if they are meant to be fairy tales? I think it's much more empowering for the believer to read these passages and see miracles and fantastical things happening because of God. When we are trained not to see the fantastic and if you will, the magical, then we are trained not to look for miracles in our everyday life. And we stop looking for God's awesome power. We stop looking to be amazed and in awe at what he does. So when I read this passage, if I allow myself to expand to, is it possible that the forest, it suggests here that the forest kills more people than David had in his forces? Is there precedent? If we look through other scripture, is there precedence here to suggest that when God made creation, he endowed it with agency? I'm not talking about forest nymphs, and I'm not talking about spirits inside trees and individual spirits. I'm talking about God's empowerment of nature and his ability to call nature up to his will. I have seen, as I've built this theorem, as I'm going through this podcast, I believe I see evidence that when God created creation, it was intended to be, creation is a mirror of God. It is his design. It is intended to be something that shows us without excuse who God is and what God is about and how God works. Every day, we're supposed to go out and be in it and see it. We're supposed to see the miraculous. We're supposed to see the plant that doesn't have the chemicals to do X, Y, Z in the Bible, or sorry, in the body. If we look at it under the microscope today, it doesn't have those chemicals. But tomorrow, it's pulled those chemicals somewhere out of the earth crust into itself to repel an insect that now is more medicine for us. We're supposed to see that that plant has agency, and that is miraculous. There's intelligence there. We're supposed to see that that is God given and be in awe of it. So I think that nature was created to do that and do that only. And it cannot do other than that. It can only act in God's design. It can only praise God. If that's true, then when we see moments in the Bible where God has pulled a heavenly host together, maybe it's not just angels. Maybe God is using other parts of his creation to effect his will. And if I'm right, then we should be able to look back in the Bible and see that happening. And I look through just a couple incidences. We see Moses talking to a bush that bursts into flame but isn't on fire and doesn't become consumed. That's crazy. And the bush talks. The rocks cry out. We see another instance I think that is a good one to draw on is Elijah when he is standing on the side of the mountain, and this happens in 1 Kings 19, where he's in the cave and God says, "Go out and talk to me." And it says that he is in the cave and he hears a great and powerful wind, and it's going through and rending the mountaintops. It's tearing apart the mountaintops, but God wasn't in it. The wind is going through and tearing things apart. The wind has agency to do that, but God wasn't in it. Um, we see then that there is an earthquake and God's not in that, and there's fire and not in that, but then there's a gentle blowing. We see nature having agency here. Um, and I despair if I'm not bringing you along and kind of showing you enough of where my mind is going. Sometimes I don't exactly know where my mind is going, but I see a distinction here that is much. There's a difference here when we see nature attacking. We attribute it to a bear whose created nature is to be violent, whose created nature is just, it's a dumb situation where it's just going out and it's going for prey and it's trying to eat. It's got dumb instinct. And so the attack that has happened is because of an animal instinct, but we don't put that into nature. We don't see nature acting out God's purpose or acting out on the design that it was given. On the contrary, today we see if nature is doing something, it is because man has messed it up. I think there's so much more power here when we give nature a God-given agency, a design that was perfect, the ability only to follow that design, the ability only to follow God's will. And if we allow that to be, if we can believe that and see that possibility that God is able to wield nature as he wishes, he created it with a word, so why couldn't he? Then when we have water that stands up to allow the Israelites to pass over and then crushes and kills Pharaoh's army, the water has agency. It's acting on God's command. It's doing its instinct through God's will. The water stands up for Elijah and Elisha, again, without being destructive. There are all of these moments that we're seeing in the Bible again and again where nature has a will, it's able to act on an instruction. And again, we only think about this in terms of an animal, where we can train an animal to act on our command to do our will. But if God has all of nature at his command and it has agency, then nature can act on God's will at command. It is a totally different mindset, I think, and one that I don't think is dangerous to look at here in Second Samuel with the Forest of Ephraim. It has been made magical in cinematic history now, of a forest that would come alive and be part of a battle. But if we allow God to be bigger than our confines, if we allow God to be big enough that we aren't scared to allow for the magical and the mystical and the miracle, and then we look for God in that magical, mystical miracle, we aren't confining God to this idea of a fairy tale. What is the purpose of telling a fairy tale where a forest comes alive? I don't see one, but I do see a purpose if we do tell that story and we allow for the possibility that what is written is exactly what happened. It says the forest claimed more than the sword. And then we see this ridiculous situation of a man who's caught in a tree. I think we're supposed to see the forest acting on God's will, acting on agency, because there weren't enough people to defeat those that had gathered around Absalom. Maybe there weren't enough people, but God had a will, and so he used creation and the instinct and the agency that is within all of creation, the rocks, the wind, the storm, the lightning, the water, the forest. Maybe God is bigger than we're allowing when we in the church body gloss over things in the Bible and just say, well, that's a fairy tale. It's a tall tale. Didn't really happen. Why can't it happen? My God's big enough. My God's big enough to inhabit the thing that he spoke into existence and then left for me to see him in every single day. I go out and I see a leaf and I see a tree and I see the way that it's all working together and I see God. And in a story about a forest that carries out God's will in driving down an uprising and taking out a people that are going to get in the way of where God is taking David. Um, my God's big enough to do that. And it expands my wonder and it makes me go out and look at his creation with more respect and him as the creator with more respect, not less. I think we're doing ourselves a disservice by not looking at these moments. And I pray that you are being drawn into these moments everywhere throughout the Bible to look a little bit closer. Words have meaning. Stories have meaning. God, if we truly believe that God breathed these words into man to write down, he had a purpose for every story. So what is this doing here? And how can we use it to turn and see him for more and to love him for more and be in awe? I pray that he is blessing you with that today and blessing you with the curiosity to go and look deeper. And I would love to hear from you, and I hope I see you here on another day.